All right, come on in, everybody. Settle down in your seats, online virtual seats. Hello and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Arehart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the Meetup, being recorded on Thursday, November 4th, 2021 at noon U.S. Eastern Time, in our 292nd episode, I'll also be your speaker. And I'll be presenting to you on migrating apps to ColdFusion 2021 from earlier versions. Before we get started, let me just take a moment to also point out something that I don't often take the time to do. For those who don't know, all the sessions are recorded, and you can find them at this simple to remember URL of recordings.coldfusionmeetup.com, and that coldfusionmeetup.com is the easy way to remember the group. And on that group site, I have links to it on the announcements. If you sign up to be a member of the group, you'll get an email, and in that email announcing the events, I also tell you the link to the recordings. So hopefully everybody can always find the recordings, no trouble. And then also want to remind you that if you're at all interested in presenting on the ColdFusion Meetup, the online ColdFusion Meetup, I'd welcome having you. And pretty much any topic related to ColdFusion or Lucy or anything tangentially related to CFML is welcome. And you can learn more about speaking and find answers to common questions at speak.coldfusionmeetup.com. And also, since I'm the only one here, I don't have a co-host, can anybody write a comment? Drew, I see you wrote a comment. You just Drew. I'll ask you, Drew, since you're paying attention. And so when we get too many, just write a comment, Drew, into the comments that tells me you can hear me okay. Usually I would judge that by the other person that's presenting, that I could hear them and they could hear me. But right now I don't have anything to go on. So, all right, he's not responding. So let me ask as a comment, can anyone confirm that you can hear me? Okay, cool. Suddenly I get a flood of yeses. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you're all paying attention. Thank you very much. All right, awesome. Let's go ahead and continue. Excellent. All right. So yeah. And there's my contact information. I'll repeat it at the end as well. And I show it throughout. As you can reach me by email and then through all social media. I'm available at just Arehart. Really easy to remember. All right. So what we're going to talk about today. Well, we're going to start with, so we're talking about migration. Let me just back up to help those who maybe just showed up and didn't read the description. We're talking about migrating apps to CF 2021 from earlier versions, meaning you might be coming from 2018, but you might be coming from 2016 or 11 or 10 or 9 or 8. And you might think, oh, come on, Charlie, nobody's running 8. Trust me. I know people that are still running 5. It's terrible. Let me just say this real quick. It's not the point of the topic, although it is something I allude to towards the end. You shouldn't be running on such old versions. You shouldn't be running on CF 2016. Because CF 2016 got its last updates in March of this year. There will be no more updates to 2016. And the last updates to CF 11 were in 2019. And the last updates to CF 10 were in 2017. It's always 5 years of updates, and then they stop updating it. So anyway, we'll talk about that again towards the end. But the point is, you really don't want to be on such old versions. Anyway, some people do, maybe they're finally getting around to it. Whatever reason. There's all kinds of reasons people can choose to finally upgrade. Maybe they got money. Maybe they got hacked. Maybe they got a new, person in charge who said, we don't want to run on old unsupported software. So lots of people are moving to CF 2021. It's been out for a year, literally this month. And so some people wait to see how things shake out. And there's some things that came up and some have been addressed. In fact, almost I think everything that's a big deal issue has been addressed. So we'll talk about that as we move on. And that's the point of what we're going to talk about is what were compatibility issues that were introduced in 2021 itself. And then what are some issues that have been introduced in the recent updates? So as you guys know, CF gets updates usually every 3 or 4 months, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. That's usually about every quarter. And there have already been 2 updates to 2021. And sometimes, there were problems and updates to the previous versions as well, and they got fixed by subsequent updates. Well, we're talking about moving to 2021. So I'm saying with 2021, there are some issues in the current available updates, like update 2, and you need to deal with those. And if they come out with a new update in 2 months, then those that move to 2021 2 months from now, who have that latest update installed, they're not going to hit these issues, right? So we do need to consider not just what might be issues introduced by the base CF 2021, but what might be issues introduced by the current updates. And then we'll move on to what were issues introduced in 2018. So this is for people that are on 2016 or earlier. When you move from 2016 or earlier to 2021, you're also getting differences that were introduced in 2018. So you can't just focus on what's new and different in 2021. And we're just talking about compatibility issues. And there's not a lot of them. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But the point is, that's why you need to know for that, and then for 2016. So if you're coming from 11 or earlier, what were issues that were introduced by 2016? And if you're coming from 10 or earlier, what was introduced by 11? And if you're coming from 9 or earlier. Now, some of you might be going, oh my gosh, I don't want to sit around here for all this. I don't use all these versions. I'm just going from 2018. Well, yes, you could then just pay attention to the first 2 points, but then I'll have some concluding points towards the end of migration tools and resources. So if you want to check out, for the next 20 minutes, half an hour, I understand that. But follow along, because you might learn of some things that you haven't tripped over yet, but you might, because you might try to use something and suddenly find out, oh, that changed in 2018 or that changed in 2016. And we hadn't even tried it yet, even though we've been on 2018. So anyway, I hope all this will help lots of different people. Let me hop over to get the comments. There you go. Cool. All right, let's move on. So how easy will such a migration be, right? That's the most important question people would wonder. And I get asked all the time. And I'll just say that it depends, of course, on how many versions back you're jumping up from. So it's going to be easier if you're just coming from 2018. It's going to be a little harder from 2016, a little harder from 11, a little harder from 10. But it's not, like an asymptotic curve, if you know what that is. It's not going to be exponentially harder. It's just going to be a little harder, a little harder, a little harder. And I'm just going to say this right up front, because people need to hear this. For some, it may be trivial. Okay, cool. Jim says he's starting a new project where they're on 11. So for some people, even a move from 11 would be trivial. You may find things just work. And I want to put that out there, because I know a lot of people that are reluctant to upgrade because they think, oh my gosh, it's going to be a nightmare. It's going to take days or weeks or months. And it's like, no, it might just take the hour it takes to install the new version and run your code, and it just works. It could be literally that trivial. I'm telling you, because I do this with people every day. And then for others, I say it may seem difficult. Of course, it may be difficult too. But when I say it may seem difficult, what I'm getting at is you might find that the front page of your app fails and you're like, oh, this is going to be a nightmare. But maybe it's just something that's on literally like the application CFC or CFM, and you fix that problem and everything works. Or let me say this, it may be that it's not that, it's on this page and that page, and every 23rd page you look at, it's broken. Well, maybe it's one thing that if you just fix that one thing everywhere that it occurs, well, that's it. And it might be a global find and replace, and you're done. So literally, it could just be an hour of work. And I'm just telling you, I see this stuff every day. So it could be that easy. It could be that easy. And it may for you be difficult. And it may actually maybe you just got some unusual situation where you hit every problem there is, and it feels like it takes a week to get everything working. I appreciate that. That can happen to some people. And my point is that for most people, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. It might be trivial, it might be difficult, but it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. Now, let me clarify what we won't cover, because this is just about migration, issues that you're going to hit. So I'm not in this talk talking about what's changed, what's new. I'm not talking about what can you take advantage of in the new versions. And I'm not going to, of course, talk about that in the various previous releases. If you're interested in that, first of all, Ben Nadel has got a post on that he just did this week, where he has, from various resources, including some of mine, put together a list of what were the language improvements in CF versions starting at 2021. She goes in the reverse order. I think he starts at 11 and then maybe does 10, 11, 2016, 2018, and then 2021. And he just added 2021 yesterday or the day before. And he acknowledged that he'd gotten that from this next resource, which is I've got a hidden gems talk. As some of you know, every version of CF that comes out, I do a hidden gems talk on that version. All of them are at my site at carehart.org/presentations, along with all whatever 140 of other talks I've done. I think this is literally the 140th different ColdFusion presentation I've done. And in those hidden gems talk, I cover not only language changes, but also installation and administration changes, underlying library version changes, OS and DB support changes, licensing and pricing different changes, differences between enterprise and standard, if there are any changes in that. So again, that's what the hidden gems gets into, and that's why, you know, it's a whole talk itself for each release. But again, Ben's talk just focuses on the new language improvements, which if you're a developer, that may be what you're most focused on. Although I'll throw out there that, you know, you often as a developer need to really focus on these other things as well. So you ought to look at my talks, and most of them have recordings, or they're all available as PDFs for you to just look at. And as you guys can see on the screen, I try to put most of what I'm going to say there. I hope it doesn't annoy those who don't like to see it. You want to see pretty pictures. But the point is, you might look at this slide PDF later, and I want you to be able to see what I was getting at. All right, so let's move on. Quickly about myself. For those who don't know, because some people don't know, they go, I just need to see Charlie out there in the community all the time, don't know what he does for a living. Well, I focus on primarily CF, server troubleshooting, also help folks Lucy. And I'm an independent consultant, so I don't work for anybody. I work with, you know, I do work with the Fusion Reactor guys. I do work with Adobe in some situations, but the point is, on my own, you know, 80-90% of the work I do is on my own. People just come to me directly, and I help people of all sizes and experience levels. So whatever your problems you may face, run them by me. That's what I do. And I work remotely, you know, like everybody now, but this has been the way it's been for 15 years. 99% of the time, I'm just remote. And so it's safe and secure and easy by a shared desktop. And most importantly, I solve most problems in less than an hour. And I teach you as we go so that you can understand what we found and how you could have found it on your own, so that you eventually don't need me again for that problem. And you might think, well, that's a curious way to make a living. More than that, I offer a satisfaction guarantee. So if you feel like the time wasn't valuable, you won't pay for that time. And I'm sure somebody's thinking, son, you're never going to make it in this business. But this is the way I've been working for 15 years. So you can find more about my rates and approach and everything, the satisfaction guarantee, at arehart.org/consulting. But again, in this session, I'm not selling anything. I'm just sharing my experience and the experience of others that I've found, because other people have reported issues and I've gathered those up in this presentation. All right, so let's move on. Compatibility issues introduced in CF 2021. And this has been the biggest one for a lot of people, the date format capital D issue. So again, we're talking about if you're moving to 2021, let's say from 2018, your code worked fine on 2018, or remember, any prior version too, but just for now, what was the difference, let's say, between 2018 and 2021? The biggest issue that people have tripped over, and it, of course, affects everybody coming from other versions as well, is this date format capital D issue. So what it is that capital D in the date format function is honored as meaning the day of the year. Now, for all prior versions, it was regarded as the same as lowercase d, which was day in the month. And that's a big difference. That's a huge difference. If you've got code that uses capital D or capital DD, it's going to produce very different results. So here's an example. If you had, you know, you won't have this hard-coded date. Of course, you have a variable. But if that variable had that number of, say, 11/23/20, and you said capital MM, capital DD, capital YY, you would have gotten in prior releases what you'd expect, 11/23/2020. And yes, for our European friends, you'd switch to DDMM. We understand that. The point is in 2021, oh my gosh, look at this. That instead produces 11/3/28. That's the 328th day of November 23rd. And isn't that crazy? And the reason that's 2020 is that I was documenting all this when 2021 came out. And there were blog posts and community forum threads. And I did some blog posts where I pointed out this problem. And I went ahead and put together a running example if you need to see it. And it's on the CF Fiddle site. And if you just visit this URL, you could see that running example. And let me say this now, when we're done, I'll push this up to my server, to arehart.org/presentations, and you'll be able to have it. I'm sorry, I meant to do it beforehand, but I had a client that had an issue and we ran right up to just before we got started. So I'll get this posted after the session. And the point I'm making is, by now you can write that down if you want to, but some of these are going to be big, long URLs. I can't always, or I didn't always use a bit.ly because I wanted to see what it was. So anyway, and if it fit on the screen. I went ahead and just showed it. But for really long ones and gnarly ones, I created a bit.ly link. All right. And this was because I was sharing that back in the forums last year. And then I did a blog post back then on this issue, and I called it a breaking change. Now, if we left it at that, you might go, man, that sucks. I can't believe they would do that. Well, it's not. We're not done. But first of all, literally later that month of November 2020, Adobe heard enough people complaining about this in the days after CF 2021 came out that they made a fix. And they provided that fix then, and then they folded that fix into the next update, which was called Update 1, which came out in March of 2021. Now, let me be clear. That fix does not revert the behavior. It does not. It requires you to add a JVM argument to revert the behavior, to go back to regarding the capital D, the same as a lowercase d. So if you want to do that, you can do that. But some of you will say, you know, I'd really rather just fix this problem instead of worrying about putting in JVM arguments everywhere. So here's a regex, and there were a couple guys. I'm sorry, I didn't take note in my notes here to remind me who they were. I think it was Scott Steinbeck. Oh, I can't remember. Apologies to the other person. But anyway, here are regexes that they offered, and I'll point you to a blog post in a moment where you can see them yourself and see who they were. Anyway, the point is you could run either of these regexes. One might work in one editor, one might work better than another. I think the second one worked in Sublime for the gentleman who posted that. I apologize again for not recognizing who that was. But anyway, the point is you could run this and it would look for occurrences of a capital D in a date format function. And they're done different ways, so let's not get into that. And there's the blog post I did in December announcing the fix that Adobe had come out with. And then in that, I've since posted it to clarify that it was provided in Update 1 in March. But in there, I talk about and I point to resources where Adobe also talked about this JVM argument that you need to add. So if you're interested in this problem, if you fear it, you could just put that JVM argument in and revert the old behavior. If you want the capital D for some reason, then you don't want to put that JVM argument in which case you want to find all the places where your current code does use a capital D and use these regexes to find it and change it. All right, moving on. Now, sometimes new releases of CF will remove features, and trust me, most of them are ones that virtually nobody uses. So don't feel like, oh my gosh, they're going to break all my code. Do you use Corbett integration? Oh, well, if you do, you can't do that anymore. Do you use, what was it, Lifecycle Data Services, LCDS? Can't do that anymore. Still using Flex somehow? Can't do that. Doing Flash Paper? Can't do that. And this is a weird one. I don't know why they did that, but they removed the ability in CF Schedule to do an on misfire, fire now. Again, they took it away. Don't know why. The good news is it doesn't seem like anything's been deprecated or retired, and we're going to see what retired means in a subsequent version where they retired something that might be important. All right. So again, this is what was removed in 2021. There'll be things that if you're jumping from, say, 10 or 11 that were removed in 2016 or in 2011 in CF11, so we'll come back to those later. Some other compatibility issues that might trip you up, and this one might be a big deal. Static is now a reserved word, but only in a CFC. Only in a CFC. So if you have a variable called static, you'll get this error called cannot assign a value to a variable named static. And to allow that in a CFC, if you need to, you've got old code that uses static, then you would add this to your component definition. Static support equals false. The default is true. So you would say, no, I don't want static support. I want my old code to work. And let me add too that the problem doesn't apply if you're using static as a struct, a key. So if it's something dot static, I've already proven that's not an issue. And also this has nothing to do with the CFM. It's only CFCs. It's just a curious thing, but it is what it is. And so here's a link with more information on it. It's actually documented in the ColdFusion docs if you know where to look. And that's what I link you to here is the docs for that issue. And then I want to move on. So again, if there's any questions on these, you guys ask me. And in fact, I should have said this. I say this later about another reserved word issue that was in another version. You might say you don't think you use this stuff because you wrote every line of code. Good for you if you did. I hear that a lot. But maybe you're leveraging some library. Maybe it's a framework. Maybe it's some custom tag. Maybe it's some included file of something, whatever. The point is somebody else's code that you've inherited or that you have leveraged might be doing it. And it's very common for frameworks like Model Glue, Mach 2, Fusebox, and perhaps even Coldbox, but they're usually on top of it. That's, they're still upgrading it pretty active, very actively. What I meant to say is I don't think the other ones are upgraded at all. CF Wheels was upgraded relatively recently. My point is sometimes people have code in their environment from a framework that might be years old, and maybe it is an updated framework, but they haven't bothered to update it because they just didn't want to bother with it. And so their old code may have such things in it. So just don't think, I don't think I use that. No. You should look for it and find out if you do. And I was helping somebody where we did find it, and it was in some old, I think it was in Transfer, which was a ORM framework before ColdFusion provided its own. Anyway, now let's move on. I want to offer some bonus topics as we go. Okay, here's one stuck on a previous version of this framework. That's right. That's what I meant. I guess when you say or stuck in a previous version, maybe you can't upgrade it. But I think often it's that people just don't want to. They could. And Troy mentions the FCK editor and CK editor. It's been renamed, I believe. One is the other one I forget. Comes to mind from back in the day in file upload. Maybe that would have this sort of issue. But since if it's about the ColdFusion code that goes with the editor, CK editor, FCK editor, that was provided by Adobe, I'm pretty sure. So if that were an issue, they would fix it in the new version in 2021. But as you mentioned, talking about CF9, yes, issues like this have happened in the past. All right, moving on. So for while I'm giving you the bad news, as it were, sometimes I want to give you some good news. I call it a bonus topic, a little tip that might help you. It might not really be directly related to coding, but it might be. And so one thing I want to point out is that we're talking about CF 2021 before we move on, is that if you didn't hear this news, this is important. CF 2021 has lifted the requirement that in order to use what's called the CF Security Code Analyzer, you have to be using ColdFusion Enterprise. That was true when the tool came out in CF 2016. It's no longer true. You can be on a standard license, and you could use that in a way that might be able for you to use this tool. And actually, I should back up. And it also now works with the developer edition. That's the more important thing, right? So it also works with the developers. So it used to be that you couldn't use it with developer, you couldn't use it with standard. You had to have an enterprise license, even if that meant taking that enterprise license and putting in a development environment. Well, that's been lifted in 2021. It's no longer required, which is pretty awesome. Yeah, good for you, Joseph. So just real quick, I'm going to show that just to demonstrate that I'm not just blowing smoke and parroting what Adobe says. Here's my CF admin. I happen to be running standard. And here's CF Builder. And I'm not going to talk about how to set up CF Builder to be able to do it. I'm going to do that in another talk because it's been a long time. Now, listen, I know some of you are immediately going to be saying, well, I ain't going to be using CF Builder for nothing. I get that. I understand it. It's not your favorite tool. But the point is the CF Security Code Analyzer that was introduced in CF 2016 does only work currently with CF Builder. And let me just say it because I'm not looking at the chat. Adobe has announced that they plan to rewrite CF Builder on VS Code. So yes, in the future, you will get a CF Builder that runs on VS Code. And I'm assuming that that new CF Builder running on VS Code will support the Security Code Analyzer. And you'll be able to do what I'm about to show you in VS Code. Okay, let's get that out of the way. But for now, you have to use CF Builder. And there's even a free version of it. And I haven't tested whether this works with the free version of CF Builder. But the point is, when you buy a license of ColdFusion, you get a license for CF Builder. Again, we're getting far off of the migration discussion, but let me just say that once you've got things properly set up, you have a server configured to point to a running ColdFusion, and you've got a project that's a ColdFusion project, and it's configured to point to that server. I'm just going by that real fast because that's another whole bunch of discussion. But then you can right-click on a file and choose Security Analyzer, and it runs the analyzer. And it might open up in a tab over here. I brought it over here, and there was no problem with this. And just to show you what could happen, I'll change this to refer to a URL variable, and I'm just CF outputting it. That's bad, right? And when I right click and run Security Analyzer, it says, well, what are you doing? You've got a cross-site scripting problem. And there it is right there. You're now vulnerable to cross-site scripting, and you should use the encode for function that was introduced in CF10. And there's encode for HTML, for example. So anyway, that's the security code analyzer. My point was that it's now available to be used with CF 2021. And that's pretty good news. Another reason to consider moving to 2021. And I saw, yep, good news. Excellent. All right, excellent. All right, so I got some bonus. Moving on. And I wrote a blog post about the fact that it was now in standard and developer. Here is the URL for that. So if you want to share it with somebody, you'll be able to do that. Again, you'll get the presentation after the talk. I'll have the PDF up there. Now, I mentioned that sometimes updates introduce problems. Update 2 is the most recent update to CF 2021, and at the same time, in September, update 13 of 2018 came out. And both versions introduced a bug in query of queries. So if your code uses query of queries, you may trip over this bug. Some people didn't, but a lot of people did. And so Adobe, again, came out within days with a special hotfix jar that you could get from them. And you would get that special hotfix jar and add it to your ColdFusion, and they give you in the notes that they share with you what to do. And once you've done that, then this bug goes away. And the intent is that in the next update, which would be update 3 or update 14 of 2018, they will include that fix and you won't need that special hotfix anymore. And this is the kind where all you got to do is add the fix and the problem goes away. Well, I bring this up to say you might try to test your code even against a currently updated, fully updated CF 2021 update 2 and find that your code breaks. And by the way, it may not break saying there's a problem with a query of queries. It might break saying some function doesn't work because the result isn't what it expected. And that's because the prior code that did the query of queries didn't produce the right result. So just be careful. You might not readily detect that the problem is due to query of queries. Just trust me. I would argue everybody should get this update. And Adobe said they were going to be posting the update in the hotfix where this was discussed. I apologize. I didn't think to put in there what that hotfix was. Let me think what's the quickest way for me to get that. Just a second. I'm going to get that. You guys can't see this. Just hang on a second. Should put this in there. My apologies for not putting that. In CF 2021, it's this jar. Let me go ahead and put that in there. I'm going to put it in the presentation, then you'll be able to see it. Okay. So that hotfix is the hotfix you would want to get from Adobe. And the 4212383 is the hotfix ID number. And sometimes you could go to tracker.adobe.com and put in CF- that number, and you'll see the tracker ticket about the issue. Sometimes you won't because it's a private ticket and they didn't make a public ticket about it. But anyway, the point is that's going to be the name of what you're going to want to look for. Before I forget, let me also update the modified date of this file to say it was modified today so that when you guys get it, it's got the right date in there. Sausage being made. All right, moving on. And let me get back to seeing the chat in case you guys have any comments. To answer Jerry's question, he said, is CF 2016 not getting updates anymore? Yes, I said that earlier, but you might have missed it. Or maybe you wanted to make sure you really heard what I said. Yes, CF 2016 came out in 2016. That's 5 years ago. So in March of this year, they got its last update. In fact, we're going to move on to that now. I do believe that's, oh no, we'll come up to that in a moment. Let's talk about 2018 first, but you'll see when I talk about 2016. Yeah, it no longer has gotten updates. So that's another reason to move to 2021 or 2018, which will be updated to 2023, right? 2018, 5 years later, 2023. That's the way it works. All right, moving on to 2018. So reserved words. There were a bunch of reserved words introduced in 2018 as well. And again, your old code might be referring to these, and that code would break in 2018, or now if you move from 2016 or below to 2021, it will break when you go to 2021. So abstract and function and final. Yeah, you were allowed to create variables with those names. Well, you're not anymore because they're now keywords. And if you enable the null support, which was a new feature in 2018, again, we're not talking about what was new, but if you enable that new null support, then the word null becomes a keyword and you can't create variables. So if you have that, you're going to get errors. And Sid's saying that was a fuse box issue. Excellent. And there you go. You may think you don't use these, but frameworks might. And I tripped over this because I had some old code for what was it called? The wiki, Ray Camden's wiki. I forget the name of it. But anyway, that wiki under the covers relied on Cold Spring. It was some old code, hadn't been updated in years. Bad on me because I could have, but I didn't. Anyway, that, and I didn't look into this to see if later versions of Cold Spring before it stopped being updated had this issue, but mine did. And it was specifically in this Cold Spring AOP framework, AOP proxy utils.cfc. It had abstract and function. And so I just went in and changed them to abstract 1 and function 1 and wherever it referred to it. And again, I want to say here, you got to be careful about doing a find and replace because you might have some place where those shouldn't change. But I was able to do a really simple find and replace and fix that problem. And I was good to go. And be careful, you just may not want to do a global find and replace because you could have text that you're changing that would show up to users too. That may not be appropriate. So again, I'll just run through. And you could just run through the code and wait and see what gets errors. That's risky too. But you got to make your call about how best to solve this problem. Just want to let you know it's an issue. This is a bigger deal for a lot of people. Again, this was new in 2018 and will affect you if you move to 2021 from 2016 or earlier. CF query param and CF proc param will now fail if you used an CF SQL type that's not valid. And I say undocumented because people used to things like CF SQL int. So they'd say CF proc param or CF query param, CF SQL type equals CF SQL int. Well, it's not supposed to be int. It's supposed to be integer. And what was happening is that prior versions of CF 2016 and earlier just accepted that. And you know what they did? They treated it as a string, CF SQL string. And that's not right. It would give you some benefit of using the CF query param, but it's not the right result, right? It's supposed to be an integer. It's supposed to be an integer. It wasn't doing that. Same with date time. You have to say CF SQL date or CF SQL time or a CF SQL timestamp. And CF SQL num should be numeric and so on. And so this is documented in the docs, and it also applies to query execute. If you don't do CF query, you do query execute. You're not out of the woods if you use query params in there. So for example, if you do query execute with some select statement, and then you have the tilde, see the bracketed ID equals 1, CF SQL type equals CF SQL integer. If you just said int, it would fail. So. And then I want to point out these changes were also rolled into 2016. So you folks who are still on 2016, if you apply that last update in March, that was called update 17, it implements this. And it's a security concern. That's why Adobe's doing it. That's why they did it in 2018. And then in March of this year, they rolled it into the 2016's last update. And so a lot of people's code broke when they did the last update. Or if you haven't gotten around to doing that update, when you do it, this stuff will happen to you in 2016 as well. But again, it's in 2018 and above. It'll happen to you in 2021. Yeah, could be a gotcha for some people. What about features removed, retired? Just a few things. CF schedules, timeout attribute. That's kind of weird. It's a long discussion. I don't understand that. I disagree with it, but that's what they did. You can add a CF setting request timeout to the page being called if that's under your control. Maybe it's not. The CF cache directory and timeout attributes were removed. Curious choices. CF collections, map and repair actions were removed. CF errors, type of monitor and option, very old from like CF 2 and 3, they've been removed. And then some features were retired, which retired means they're not there, like they were removed, but there might be ways to get them back. And according to the docs, they said they retired these things: Flash remoting, Flash-based UI elements, XML forms, Blaze DS, LCDS error, action script. So again, these are things that are also listed as removed in 2021. So in 2018, they said they were retired. Now, the retired is a much more interesting subject about this next point. Some of you use tags like CF menu, CF tree, CF input, auto suggest, CF input, source tooltip, CF calendar. Well, those things rely on an underlying library called YUI, the Yahoo UI library. Well, Yahoo stopped updating that years ago. And Adobe was kind of in a pinch because these things relied on that and it wasn't being updated by the vendor anymore. So in 2018, Adobe retired these, meaning they won't work out of the box in 2018 and above. And by the way, a later version of update to 2016, I believe, also removed it. But the point with all of this is you can renable it. If you really want to, you can renable it. There you go. CF 2016 update 3 in December 2016 started also to, quote, remove or retire these. So to add them back, you just copy the needed YUI library back into a place in CF where they go. It's in this, CF IDE, scripts, Ajax, blah, blah, blah. If you just look at the bottom of the deprecated features page of ColdFusion's docs, which is this URL, they tell you what to do, okay? So it's not that big a deal in that it's easy to put it back. One could argue it is potentially a deal in that you're putting back a very old library that hasn't been updated by Yahoo in years, but most of what it does is pretty straightforward. It doesn't seem to open up vulnerabilities, but no one can promise you that. Adobe's not promising you that. That's why they retired it. And so you add this back at your risk. But I'll just tell you, I've had lots of people do it because they didn't want to touch their code that leveraged it. And I haven't heard of any vulnerabilities introduced. But that doesn't mean there are none. So just use at your own risk. Other compatibility issues in 2018. Well, again, first I want to share some good news. If you didn't hear this, you don't need to do semicolons in CF script anymore. Some might like that. Some might think that's terrible. But the point is, I just want to throw that as a bonus piece of good news. And another is that if you hadn't heard, CF 2018 had added a new monitor called the PMT, Performance Monitoring Toolset. Again, that has nothing to do with migration, but it could help with looking at things when you're trying to understand if things working better or worse. The old CF server monitor that was in 2016 and earlier enterprise is gone, replaced with the PMT in 2018 and above, and it works in standard as well as enterprise. And again, that's another subject. And Adobe's given plenty of talks on it, written blog posts, and I've done some stuff on it, and I may do more in the future. All right, let's move on to 2016. We've got 20 minutes left if we want to end at the top of the hour. So good news is that really 2016 had very few issues. Now, this may be a big deal to some of you. One of the things they changed was they now did JSON data type detection at compile time rather than at runtime. And so some people found code was failing because of that. Well, if you want to turn that off in either 2016 or 2018 or 2021, here's a JVM argument to do that. ColdFusion literal preserve type, set it to true or false as appropriate for your particular needs. And if you do that, then you also need to clear out previously compiled CF files from the CF classes directory. Now, I'm not going to get into that in this presentation. That's not our focus today. But here is, again, a discussion in an Adobe document that explains this and tells you this and tells you need to clear the CF classes. And then other resources talk about how to do that, and I can help you with that as well. All right, so let's move on. Again, not a lot in 2016. CF collection ignores the path attribute and uses the path defined in the administrator. So basically, you can't tell CF collection to put collections anywhere. They have to be all in one place, and that's defined in the admin. And collections are Solr collections in CF9 and above, Solr collections. And then Microsoft Access, there are still people using it. I still see it at least once a month. And there were issues with it no longer working as of CF10. And there were workarounds back in CF10 and 11. And then it seemed that as of 2016, those workarounds weren't working for people anymore. So if you're still on Access, just beware. Even as far back as 2016, as far back as CF10, there were issues. And 10 was in 2012. Really, people should be getting off of Access. It's been trouble for years, even before 2012. But anyway, I just want to throw out that some people are finding Access works in 2021. So, I hate to share that because I don't want to enable people, but some people say I got other things to do. I can't be focused on changing my databases. So, but really, no one should be using Access anymore. And then a little bonus, just want to make sure you know about this. 2016, again, I'm not talking about all the things that were new. I could for a whole talk for each version, but I just want to throw out for we focused on migration issues. I want you to be aware that CF 2016 added a new ability to store ColdFusion sessions in a Redis data store. lot of people have been running on 2016, 2018, 2021, never paid attention to it, didn't know about it because it's an administrative setting. But the point is, you as a developer, that could be pretty cool, right? Because this means you could restart ColdFusion and the sessions wouldn't be lost. People's logins would not, they wouldn't have to log out and log in again on a restart of CF, right? That's pretty cool because the Redis is a separate thing from ColdFusion. Now that Redis could be something you install locally. There's third-party services. If you're in the cloud, there's cloud-based versions of Redis. So there's plenty of ways to run Redis. Again, I should do a talk on this at some point. But anyway, let's move on. And good, I see some people talking about access, better and worse. All right, back to CF11. Now, this is also very important. Now, some of you may go, we don't need to worry about that. We've been running on 2016 or above. Then you don't need to pay attention to this. But if you're on 11 or 10 or earlier, Update 3 of 11 re-enabled a long dormant CF proc param DB var name. It was ignored after CF5 last used it. It was ignored since CF6, and then briefly in 701, I was in the middle of saying 6 and 7. CF6 stopped paying attention to it, and then briefly in 701 they tried to bring it back and got a lot of fight. Well, for some reason, out of the blue, CF11 Update 3. And going forward in CF 2016, 2018, and 2021, it now honors that DB var name. And that'd be okay as long as the variable name that you name, which is the name of the stored proc variable name in the stored proc, if you could just get by with that name, then there's no problem. But the problem is some databases now require that you prefix the DB var name as it exists in the stored procedure. So in SQL Server, it's an @ sign. In Oracle, it's a colon. And you may have old code that just says DB var name equals parameter 1, and that could now fail. For SQL Server, it should say DB var name equals @param 1. Okay, so I'm saying you need to look into this. It might be something that would trip you up. Okay, I wish that would allow Redis clusters. Currently, it's only single node Redis. Well, George, let me just say, he said in the comment, I wish that the Redis feature allowed clustering. Pay close attention to whether that might be something that's been fixed in some update, like Update 2 of 2021. They could have addressed that recently. I don't remember hearing that as an issue. You may be right. But I would also say, if the Redis cluster is, behind a Redis cluster load balancing capability, ColdFusion wouldn't know about it. It would just talk to the one and the other would talk to the others. So that you can at least get that. Redis, by its nature, if you have multiple Redises running and they're connected to each other, they just inherently replicate to each other. And then as far as CF reaching them, I would think that if there was a load balancer in front of them, CF wouldn't know about it. But again, you may be right. Yep, and you're saying with confidence, has not been fixed or allowed. So is there a Adobe Tracker ticket that you're aware of that addresses this? And I'll just say that if there's not, or if you don't know, I want to stress everybody should look for that and add stuff in there. We'll talk about that later because Adobe does pay attention to it. Anyway, let me move on. So this is important to hear about this CF proc param DB var name thing. Back in CF11, Adobe heard the hue and cry from the crowd, and they added a JVM argument that allowed you to revert the behavior back, but that was not brought into 2016 and above. So you cannot, in 2016 and above, undo this behavior. So again, if you're moving from either 11 that was never updated or 10 or earlier, you may trip over this in moving to 2021. Thank you, George. All right, and so here's a blog post where I talked about this back in the past with more detail. All right, breaking changes in 11. CF Chart changed the underlying engine from Greenpoint to Zing, and they no longer used XML for extensibility, but JSON instead. And they provided a tool to assist in that conversion. It's called CF Chart _XML to JSON, and is a BAT or a shell script for Linux. And so it's in there, still there now. I'm pretty sure it's still there now. And so if you've got to deal with that, in fact, let me just look real quick. I had my Windows Explorer open a moment ago. Let's see. Is that in the 2021 bin? Yes, it is. Yeah, it's interesting. It's only here as a shell script. Hold on. That might be, I've got it sorted by date modified. Yeah, it's there both as a bat and as a shell script. So yeah, that tool is even in 2021. So you can still use it if you're moving from CF10 or earlier. You'll face this problem. Again, only if you're moving from CF10 or earlier. So again, some of these are not going to apply to you. Again, I hope you guys have paid attention that if you're just moving from 2018 to 2020, that's very little. 2016 to 2020, a little bit more. 11 to 2020, a little bit more. All right. Another one that was introduced in 2014, this was introduced, strict number validation was made true by default. And so numeric validations in tags and functions and returns from methods would fail if they were not numeric, if you told it to be numeric. And this is controllable in your application CFC or CF application with a property in application CFC or an attribute of CF application called strict number validation. You could set it to false if you didn't want it to do that. And then CF 11 update 11 curiously broke uses of API. They added that as something in the URI worker map properties for the web connector. So if you had stuff called /API, suddenly your stuff was breaking. So that was true in 11 and in 2016. And then 2018 changed that API thing to now be instead /CF API resource. You hardly ever did this. ColdFusion was calling it under the covers. But the point is, if you had a /API folder, you couldn't use it. Well, as of 2018, they fixed it and they called it CF API resources. So it's not something you use, but now it won't conflict with what you use. And then they did in 11 also introduce a /REST feature, which I can't remember if that was in 11 or 10, but that also caused a conflict back then. All right, things removed from 11. They started obsoleting things that were just deprecated before, mostly just attributes of tags. And Adam Cameron did a blog post back in that time frame, about 2014, where he listed them. And I'll just point you there to his blog post, because if you try to find it in the docs, sometimes you can't find readily what was specifically done in 11. You find just what's there now. And then they also removed CF graph, CF servlet, and CF text input, which you probably didn't use. CF graph was replaced with CF chart. And then they deprecated a lot more things, meaning they could remove them in the future, but if they're not removed, you can still use them. So again, if you look at the deprecated features page, there is a table that shows you for every version what was removed. It's in like an alphabetical order, I think, and then it says what version removed it. It's kind of, I wish it could be done differently. But anyway, moving on. Back to some good news. CF11 did add, and this is very important you guys hear this. If you're moving to 2021 and starting to do updating of code and you haven't paid attention to this, CF11 had added the ability for you to write entirely in CF script if you want to, because every tag had a corresponding CF script equivalent as of CF11. That's pretty cool. In fact, before I go on, let me see if there's any comments. Let me back up for a second. Jerry says, in moving from CF, it's not CF 2011. I keep stressing that because people get confused. It was CF11 that came out in 2014. Anyway, in moving from CF11 to 2016, sometimes my charts are all black. Well, to 2016, I would just say make sure you're on the latest update of 2016, because maybe that was a bug in some version of 2016 that was fixed by some subsequent update to 2016. And then most importantly, since 2016 is no longer being updated, you really ought to be moving to 2018 or 2021. And if you were to find in either of those with their latest updates that happened to you, then you could file a bug report at tracker.adobe.com. And Adobe does address those bugs. I'll talk about that in a moment. So anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for that. So now back to the presentation. Another little bonus, I want you guys to know that CF11 added in the admin a page to see what's called a secure profile that was introduced in 10. You could see all 20 settings of the secure profile and whether they were turned on or turned off. And you might go, what's that got to do with migration? No, it does. Because when you have somebody else who installs your CF 2021 or 2018 or whatever, they get asked during the installation, do you want to enable a secure profile? Yes or no? And the average admin doesn't know anything about your code. They're going to go, yeah, sure, I want to be secure. And now, bam, your CF is now more secure, and your code that used to work might not work anymore. Well, this admin page at least in 11 above, you can look at it and see what are the 20 secure profile settings that might be affecting your code's inability to work. So it's worth knowing from a migration perspective. And then there were some things that were formerly enterprise only that were now, as of CF11, available in standard. And one is the CAR mechanism, CF archives. Prior to 11, you had to be on enterprise. So if you're on 11 or above standard, you can use the CAR mechanism to move settings, as an export out to then import them onto a new server. That's really important. And then the security sandbox, which was a way to lock down code and what code in different directories could do. That security sandbox used to be enterprise only. Now it's in standard. And that's another one that I want to do a talk on. And HTML5 charts were now made available, and the WebSocket limit was lifted. So that's just things got better in 11 about some compatibility stuff. And then here's finally CF10 compatibility issues. So one is they removed Verity. So again, if you're on 9 or earlier and you're using Verity and you move to 2021, you can't use Verity anymore because it was removed in 10, replaced with Solar. And then web services were changed in 10 to default to supporting, there was the two different things. There was the SOAP version and the, I forget, another thing. There were two versions. Anyway, this thing called version 2 became the default. And if you wanted to, you'd have to change it back to version 1. And I've seen people move into 2018, move into 2016, move into 2021, who find that this code that used to work suddenly breaks. And it's because this version was changed to this new default. And the good news is you can change it back either at the admin level or at the application level or at the code level with something called WS version. Yeah, access to. Thank you, Drew. Yeah, it was access and the other thing I said. Anyway, I was also noticing Jim making the suggestion about replacing CF chart, and he's right. There's other tools out there that do charting, and I believe I have a category of those in my CF411. So if you go to CF411.com, that is a website with thousands of resources and tools in hundreds of categories of things that I've found over the years have served as alternatives. And I'm pretty sure I have charting alternatives. If I don't, I should add that. Anyway, back to bonuses. CF10 is what added the secure profile that enabled those 20 admin settings to be more secure if you check that checkbox during the install. And in 10, it was a one-time choice in the admin, the install. And then 11 added the page in the admin to be able to manipulate it. And I'm just saying, it might manipulate how your app runs if somebody enables it. So you need to be aware of it. All right, wrapping up. Good, 5 minutes left. This is perfect. So there's tools and resources that you should be aware of. First, let's talk about tools. If you didn't know it, the CF Administrator has a code compatibility analyzer. It's been there forever. I'm not saying it's great. I'm not saying everybody's going to love it. I'm not saying it's going to find every issue. But you should just at least be aware that it's there, and it's been in CF Admin forever. It's not new to 2021. And so if you, this is my CF 2021 admin. If you go to this was all changed in 2018. The look is very different since 2018. These things on the left are what used to be sections. And then when you pick one, these things across the top used to be under that section. Well, now they're just across the top. So anyway, this is the debugging and logging section. And in that is, debug output settings and debugging IP addresses and stuff like that. Well, look right there, code analyzer. So the way the code analyzer works is you point it at some directory that has code you want to analyze. And by the way, this browse thing, since CF10, it's been a jQuery thing. It's no longer a Java applet. So some of you guys that have been around, folks, guys and gals and others who have been around a long time, you didn't ever want to click that button because it was a stupid Java applet that didn't work. Well, that was fixed in CF10. 9 years ago. Okay, so start using the features in the admin that say browse server, and you could browse to whatever folder you want. And I've got a directory that's got some code in it, and I want to tell it by default, it says I'm going to analyze everything, subdirectories, CFMs. You can change it to limit it if you want to. I'm going to validate CFML. You could pick what version against which to validate it. I'll leave it at 2018. And that's it. You just click run analyzer, and it's going to look in the code file by file and produce a report that will pop up in a moment and tell you. And of course, if you have 10,000 files, it'll take a few minutes. If you've only got 1,000 files, it might take just a few seconds. And it says that it found some issues with some code that I've got in here. And some of these are examples that I've gotten from people and demos I've written. So let's just take a quick look at this one called Create Object. When you click on it, it opens up a little pop-up box that says, hey, just be aware, CF 2021 has basically removed the ability to call Corba objects. So if you're using Corba objects, you should remove that. And then they show you the template and the line numbers on which it occurs and several of the line numbers. And you could look at it and decide, is that an issue for us? Yes or no. And of course, you can make the box bigger and that could help. And none of these do. And you might go, well, that's pretty annoying. So it's telling me I might have a problem. Yeah, unfortunately, it tells you things that you might have a problem. Now, notice it says it's info. If you wanted to, you could say, all right, that's annoying. I don't want to know about those info things. I just want to know about errors. So if we come back here and go to advanced options, you can say, I only want to focus on errors. Now, if you do this, let me just tell you, you then have to pay attention to this box down here. You have to select everything. If you don't, watch what happens when you click Run Analyzer. It says, hey, you haven't selected anything. The box is up here if you're not seeing it. So you have to select either everything or whatever you want to pick, but the point is I'll just do everything and run it again. And now we'll see that it doesn't show those infos. It only shows these errors. And in this case, it's telling me this, and you might go, what's the error there? Well, it's not an error. It's that I've already started leveraging in CF 2021 the new feature related to SAML, and they're just telling me, well, but if this code had been running in 2018, that would no longer be valid in 2021 because CF now has a function called that. So again, that's one where I could go in and tell it not to show that because I could pick what things to pay attention to or not. Anyway, that's the code analyzer. Just want you to know that it's available. Let me look and see if there's any comments. Nope. Okay, cool. So you should check out the code analyzer. You might find it's helpful. You might not. And then I want you to know, if you haven't seen it, Adobe created a CF fiddle. And if you've used other languages, there's JavaScript fiddles and all kinds of other fiddles. Well, CF's fiddle is called cffiddle.org. And if you go to that website, you can run code against CF 2021, CF 2018, and CF 2016, all at their latest update level, which could be helpful. So check that out. If you don't want to install 2021, but you don't find out, will this code be a problem if I go to 2021, then you go to the CF Fiddle site. And let me just quickly open it for those who've never seen it before, cffiddle.org. We may go just a couple minutes over, but I think it's worth seeing it. So you just start putting code in here, CF output. Now, yes, I could do script. I appreciate that. Let me just do this. And it's even got a bit of an editor in it, tried to put in, code completion. And there's today's date, and I could change it to look at CF 2018, CF 2016. Not that's going to make any difference for that function, but that's CF Fiddle. Now, you should also be able to log in, and then you could, actually, you can save anything. Like you could say, if I click save on this, it pops up a URL. Actually, it's up here. This is the URL. I could give that URL to people to run. So that's a nice feature. You don't have to log in to be able to do that. But if you logged in, you would be able to create entire apps. You could create a multi-file app. You could even have an application CFC or CFM and other code in a folder. And then you could share that with people. Well, I've found that this login feature, which always has relied on either Facebook or Google, I've found that recently these don't work, and I need to report it to Adobe if nobody else has. But anyway, so unfortunately that feature doesn't work. Yep, thanks, Drew. Yep, got to go. I understand. Just about to wrap up. I understand people got to go. That's why I was letting you know. And then there's also trycf.com, which has existed for a long time, in fact, longer than the CF Fiddle. And it supports also all 3 latest versions. Might even go to 11. I just can't remember. And it supports Lucy, both 4 and 5 as well. So great that you can run these tests in these tools. And it too lets you create, they call them gists, like other things do. And you can save stuff and share it with people. And some, like the cfdocs.org and the Lucy docs, point to the TryCF site to show running examples. And the ColdFusion docs point to the cffiddle.org site to show running examples. And I want to point out as well, for migration, be aware that there's also Docker images for CF 2021, 2018. They could be used for testing. If you're familiar with Docker, yeah, you could run tests using those and not have to install CF 2021. But of course, you can install 2021. I should have said this, that if there's free developer editions Of course, there's free developer editions of ColdFusion. I say of course, but there's people that don't know that. They think they can't move to a new version until they buy a license. No. Well, first of all, there's a 30-day free trial. But then beyond that 30-day free trial, there's the free developer edition that never expires. So anyway, definitely. And then there's another subject of, can you run the new CF version alongside the old CF version? There's no upgrade. You just a side-by-side install. Yes, you can. And then it's a matter of setting up the web server configuration. I thought about getting into that, but I knew I wouldn't have time. That's another whole subject. And that's not really about migration. That's more about configuring things to support testing. But anyway, so I may do another talk on that broader subject. And then I wanted to point out some migration-oriented resources. We've talked about the deprecated features page. There's also, I want to make this clear, there's a migration guide. It's a PDF that you'll find. If you Google the phrase ColdFusion migration, it comes up as the first thing. And that's nice, but it's mostly about installation, configuration, administration, migration of those settings. There's only a couple pages about migration of code. So really, that's not something to leverage. It doesn't show any of the stuff I've talked about. There is no doc that shows what I've talked about. This is me gathering this stuff up over the years. But the CF docs do have information on new and changed features, and you should check out both the CFML reference, which is what almost everybody finds when they Google stuff, and also the guide called Developing ColdFusion Applications. I've been harping on this for years. If you printed these out, they're both about 3,000 pages. 3,000 pages. There's a user guide on ColdFusion that's not the reference that has 3,000 pages. And if you don't know that it exists, you're just trying to learn how to speak English by reading a dictionary if you just look at the CFML reference. So look for the developer guide. It's called Developing ColdFusion Applications, and you'll find it on their website. And there's blog posts from the CF team at the time of each release on the portal, which is called coldfusion.adobe.com. And there have been, for every release, multiple blog posts where they highlighted what was new and different. And sometimes they talked about migration issues. And then I can help. I'm something of the CF reference librarian, and I'm okay with that role. And then I do that consulting work to help people understand and resolve problems, migrating or otherwise. So feel free to reach out to me. And then I just wanted to finally say another reason to motivate you migrating to CF 2021 is, when does the life of the versions end? And so again, 2021 will end in 2025. And you might say, wait, that's only 4 years later. Well, it came out in 2020. Remember, it was a year ago. So technically it ends 5 years after it came out. So it'll be 2025. 2023 for 2018, 2016 already ended in March of 2021, and 11 ended in 2019. All right, and there's a page that discusses all this. This is not hidden information that only the Gnostics know. No, you can go to this page and see this information. It's been there for years. I see a question from Robbie. Has Adobe addressed when CF Builder? Yes, I talked about that, right? You missed it. No problem. So yes, they haven't said when it will come out, but yes, it will. The next version of Builder will be based on VS Code, and I've not heard any dates. I've not heard of any beta. So right now it's just a closed door, but the sign on the door says CF Builder is coming to VS Code soon. All right, so let's move on. I also want to say finally, sometimes people assert that a new CF version broke something when it's not CF's fault at all. So maybe you also move to a new box. Maybe you put in a new OS, maybe a new database. Maybe the IP address of the box is different and some server you're calling isn't allowing calls from that new IP address, right? That's got nothing to do with ColdFusion. Or maybe, and trust me, listen to this, you may find that if you put your old current CF version on that new box, it would show the same error, which would prove that the problem's not about the new version of CF. So consider that. And then too, sometimes the problem is a configuration of the administrator or of the web server that wasn't brought over from the old machine. And so you're blaming the ColdFusion and Adobe for a problem that's really, you forgot to bring something over. Like, people don't think to change the default heap size, which is a gig. And maybe in your current environment, you've got it set to 8 gig. And then you move to the new box and it's back to the default of 1 gig and it's breaking after an hour being up. Okay, so that's just administration configuration stuff. Again, I can help with that. Another key thing to pay attention to is the template cache size. You might find that, again, on the new machine, the default is the default of 1,000. And on your old machine, you maybe had cranked it up to 5,000. So I'm not going to get into that any further than to say, just be aware of those things. And I did a talk, a ColdFusion Meetup, in fact, on migrating and comparing CF admin settings. So again, check out that at my Arehart.presentations, arehart.org/presentations. And then I also want to point out that maybe the problem is you or somebody else did an update to CF, but an error occurred during the update. And there's a log that tracks update, install, success, and failure. And I have a blog post where I talk about solving common problems with doing updates. And it was CF10 that introduced the new update mechanism. So this applies to 10, 11, 2016, 2018, and 2021. And then finally, maybe the new CF is running on a more recent Java version than you used before, and maybe that Java version is causing an issue. And again, you're blaming ColdFusion for what's a Java issue. So for example, the update to Java in April, called 11.0.11 or 180.291, they both now by default block calls via TLS to a server that doesn't support at least TLS 1.2 or above. So you may find your code suddenly fails, quote, fails, and CF HTTP is failing. Adobe sucks. Can't believe they can't get CF HTTP working in CF 2021 when we move into Node. Well, maybe it's just the Java version that changed. And either you changed it or an administrator changed it. Or let me say that there's a new installer for CF 2021 that came out in September. And out of the box, it has update 2 already on it. And it has Java 11.0.11 already on it because those were, at the time they were building it, the latest available versions. So anyway, I talked about that issue of 11.0.11 specifically when that Java version came out in April. So you can read more about that later. And Sid can't get here soon enough. I don't know if you're talking about getting to 2021 or here to the presentation. I'll remind everybody the presentations are recorded, and when we're done, it'll be available on YouTube as soon as we're done. And then finally, some points to consider. We've seen often how some update will fix an issue in an early update. So when you move to 2021, it's generally just best to apply the latest update. And as I mentioned, update 2 is the latest as of this date that we're talking, November 2021. And there's a new CF installer that's pre-configured with update 2 and 11.0.11. New builder. Okay, cool. Thank you. And then remember, admin changes in each release can affect how your CFML app runs. And new features, I'm just saying, when you talk about migrating, I want you to remember that your problems you're hitting might be about admin things that somebody did or didn't change in one or the other version of CF. So consider that. And then consider when you're migrating, another benefit is that you can take advantage of the new and changed features to enable you doing more and better things. So do consider those new features. And remember my Hidden Gems talk about that sort of stuff. So this was just about migration and compatibility issues. The Hidden Gems talk for each release get into much more detail about what was new and different. So in summary, lots of migrations to be aware of, but mostly more for the older your version is. Relatively recent versions, you shouldn't find too much. But certainly for older versions, you might. And like I said earlier from the beginning, some migrations are trivial, some are difficult, most are somewhere in the middle. And I hope the talk has opened your eyes, allow you to be better prepared for whatever version you're coming from, and that I can help you with understanding, resolving issues, and to reach out to me. There's my email address and my contact information, and I'll have the slide as soon as we're done. I'll hop up and upload that. So, in fact, I'll tell you what, while I'm waiting for any questions, I may do that on another screen in the background. So Jeff says you can also test your apps in 2021 in command box. There you go. I should have said that when I mentioned, in fact, let me just do that real quick. When I mentioned the Docker images, I should have mentioned also command box. So I put that in there, and that'll be there when I upload this. Right. I don't ever mean to not mention it. It's just I'm focused on the CF things and sometimes forget about things like that. But I try always to remember it. Once in a while I forget. My apologies to everybody involved. All right. Some people got to get going. Thank you for your kind regards. What are the main differences between standard and enterprise? Does it affect performance? Well, again, that's not this talk. In fact, I've done a talk on that. So if you go to arehart.org/presentations, let me just look real quick so it can confirm for you. Yeah. So again, arehart.org/presentations, or if you just go to my site, the button right there for presentations takes you there, and just do a Google on standard, and right there. So back in 2020, differences between ColdFusion Enterprise and Standard more than you may think. And I bring that up, and I say that phrase more than you may think because some people think it's only a couple things. We don't need those things. So yeah, no, we'll stay on Standard. When you watch this presentation or see the slides, you'll go, oh my gosh, I didn't know there was that many differences. So there are many. And yes, to answer your question, Dardo, they can affect performance. Absolutely. So for some people, going to Enterprise will fix problems of performance. For other people, their issues of performance have nothing to do with going to Enterprise. So let me be clear. I'm not saying it will fix your problems. There are some problems that will fix. There are other problems that will not fix. Cool. All right. And I see other people saying nice things. So I'll just hang out another couple minutes in case anybody's got any question they were waiting to ask. And then I'll wrap up. And while we're waiting for that, let me get started the presentation. Cool. Thank you, Michael. That was my hope. And while I'm waiting for any questions, I'm getting the presentation uploaded. Looks like there's no questions outstanding. So I'll tell you what, let's just go ahead and wrap it up then. Thanks, everybody. If you're on the meetup, as a member, you've already gotten the announcement for the session next week, a security-related session without Pete Freitag, so from Brian Riley, and you can learn more about that again at coldfusionmeetup.com, and we'll talk to you all then, Lord willing. Till again, see y'all.